I wasn't exactly thrilled about this whole thing. When Luke suggested a weekend trip to some secluded lake, I thought it sounded more like a punishment than a vacation. But Luke has this way of getting you to agree to his plans, like you don't even realize what you're getting into until it's too late. Jess, his girlfriend, was already on board, and Ryan, who's always looking for an excuse to skip work, was in too. That left me and Maddie, the newbies in the group, to round out the numbers. Whispering Waters, Luke said, dragging out the name like it was some spooky campfire story. Even the name sounded like it belonged in one of those cheesy horror movies we used to watch in college. He swore the place was amazing. Crystal clear water, surrounded by forests, and a cabin that was close enough to civilization if we needed anything, but far enough away to feel like we were escaping. He conveniently forgot to mention the legend until we were already halfway there. Whispering Waters, he said again, doing his best ghost story voice. They say it remembers everyone who visits. What's that supposed to mean? Ryan asked from the back seat, sounding amused. Just a local legend, Luke said with a shrug, but he was totally enjoying freaking us out. Apparently, people who come to the lake never really leave, like it takes a part of you or something stays behind. Jess, who was in the passenger seat, turned around to face us. Okay, that's creepy. Where did you hear that? Luke waved it off. Some article online, probably just trying to scare tourists. Maddie, who had been quiet most of the drive, finally spoke up. Legends like that don't come from nowhere. The car got really quiet after she said that. Ryan laughed to break the tension. Relax, Maddie. It's a lake, not a cursed artifact. But her words stuck with me. Legends don't come from nowhere. The turnoff to the cabin was easy to miss. Just a narrow dirt road with a bunch of tall pine trees on either side. The car bounced and rattled as Luke drove down the bumpy path, and by the time we finally reached the cabin, I felt like my insides had been scrambled. The cabin itself was, well, rusted, peeling paint, a porch that looked like it was about to collapse, and this musty smell that hit us the second we opened the door. It's got character, Luke said, clapping me on the back. Yeah, if that character is tetanus, I muttered under my breath. The inside was a little better, but not much. The furniture looked like it came from a thrift store, and the kitchen appliances seemed like they were about to explode. But it was livable, I guess. We each picked a room, dumped our bags, and agreed to meet back in the living room after unpacking. When I got downstairs, Jess was looking at a book she'd found on the coffee table. Gus, look at this. It wasn't really a book, more like a journal. The cover was all cracked and worn, and the pages were filled with crazy handwriting. What really freaked us out were these phrases written over and over, like the person who wrote it was losing their mind. It knows us now. Don't listen to it. Someone's idea of a joke, Ryan said, looking over her shoulder. Probably left here to scare people. Well, it's working, Jess muttered, closing the journal and putting it back on the table. That evening, we built a fire in the fire pit outside and roasted marshmallows like we were kids again. Ryan told this ridiculous story about a haunted amusement park, complete with sound effects and everything, that had Jess and Maddie cracking up. Even I started to relax a little. The air was cool, the fire was warm, and for a minute, I thought maybe this trip wouldn't be so bad after all. Then the whisper started. At first, I thought it was just the wind, a faint rustling in the trees and around the lake. But as it got later, it got more distinct. Soft, almost impossible to hear. Voices carrying words I couldn't quite make out, I looked at the others, wondering if they heard it too, but nobody said anything. Maybe I was just imagining things. When the fire died down, we headed inside. I hung back for a second, looking out at the lake. It was so still, like a sheet of glass, reflecting the moon and stars. For a moment, I thought I saw something move in the middle of the lake, but when I blinked, it was gone. "Hey, you coming?" Blue called from the doorway. I shook off the uneasy feeling and went inside. I barely slept that night. The cabin was too quiet, the kind of quiet where you can hear every little creak and groan of the old wood. Around 2 a.m., I thought I heard footsteps outside, soft and slow. I sat up in bed, listening hard, but the sound was gone. The next morning, everyone else seemed fine, like they hadn't heard anything. Luke made coffee. Ryan cooked up some questionable breakfast, and Jess and Maddie complained about the lack of cell service. I was the only one who couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. After breakfast, we decided to explore the lake. Luke and Ryan grabbed the kayak that was stored under the cabin, while Jess and Maddie decided to walk along the shore. I went with them, my boots crunching on the damp ground. The lake was beautiful in the daylight, the water so clear you could see straight down to the bottom. But there was something about it that felt unnatural, too perfect, like it was trying too hard to be inviting. Halfway around the lake, Jess suddenly stopped. "Did you hear that?" We all froze. The only sound was the water lapping against the shore. "Hear what?" Luke asked. Jess hesitated. "It sounded like, I don't know, like someone whispering." Ryan groaned. "Okay, enough with the ghost stories. You're going to give yourself a panic attack." But Jess didn't look any less freaked out. "I'm serious. It sounded like my name." Her words sent a chill down my spine. "It was probably just the wind," I said, even though I wasn't so sure myself. We kept walking, but the mood had changed. Even Luke, who's usually so upbeat, seemed quieter than usual. When we got back to the cabin, Jess sat on the porch, staring out at the lake. "It's watching us," she said softly. "What is?" I asked. Sitting next to her, she didn't answer. That night, the whispers came back, louder and more insistent. They seemed to be coming from the lake, swirling around the cabin like a thick fog. This time, I knew I wasn't the only one who heard them. Ryan shot up from the couch, his face pale. "Who's doing that?" he demanded, his voice shaking. "Is this some kind of joke?" "No one's doing anything," Luke snapped. "It's just..." "Don't," Maddie interrupted. Her voice was calm but firm. "Don't explain it away. We all hear it." For once, Luke didn't argue. We sat in silence, listening to the whispers get louder, the words still just out of reach. It felt like they were closing in on us, waiting for something. Eventually, the whispers faded, leaving only the sound of the wind. None of us slept that night. As the first rays of sunlight crept through the windows, I realized something. The lake wasn't just a backdrop to our weekend getaway. It was alive, and it wanted something from us. The morning felt heavy, maybe from the lack of sleep, but the air itself seemed thick and oppressive. Outside, the lake was unnervingly still, reflecting the overcast sky like a mirror. Maddie was the first to speak as we gathered in the kitchen. "Did anyone actually sleep?" she asked, her voice strained. "Nope," Ryan said, rubbing his eyes. "Whoever was whispering all night, thanks for that. Real funny." "No one was whispering, Ryan," Jess snapped. She looked exhausted, her usual calmness replaced by a nervous energy. "We all heard it." Luke poured himself a cup of coffee, his movements stiff. "It's the wind," he said flatly. "We're in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by trees and water. The acoustics probably make it sound weird. Maddie gave him a look. You don't really believe that? He didn't answer, just sipped his coffee and stared out the window. We spent the morning exploring the cabin, partly out of boredom and partly to distract ourselves. The journal Jess had found was still on the coffee table, its cracked cover practically daring someone to open it. I tried to ignore it, but eventually, curiosity got the better of me. I opened it again, flipping past the repeated phrases we'd seen before. Deeper in the journal, the handwriting got even crazier, like the writer had been in a hurry, or maybe their hand was shaking. One entry stood out. They only come when it's quiet. Don't let it get too quiet. The noise keeps them at bay. Guys, you might want to see this, I said, holding up the journal. Luke glanced over my shoulder. More ramblings from some crazy old hermit. This isn't just rambling, I said, pointing to the entry. They're talking about keeping noise going, like it's a defense or something. Jess frowned. What does they mean? The whispers. I don't know, I admitted, but whoever wrote this was scared out of their mind. Ryan snorted. Yeah, or they were drunk or high or both. Either way, it's not exactly a reliable source. Maddie's voice cut through the room. What if it's true? Her words hung in the air, heavier than the silence that followed. No one laughed, no one dismissed her, because deep down, none of us could shake the feeling that she might be right. In the afternoon, we decided to split up and explore the area around the lake. Luke and Ryan took the kayaks again, while Jess, Maddie, and I walked in the opposite direction from the day before. The air was colder, the wind sharper, and the snow crunching under our boots was the only sound. It was oddly comforting, that crunching noise. It broke up the stillness that had been bothering me since we arrived. Maddie walked ahead, her eyes scanning the trees like she was searching for something. Jess stayed close to me, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. Do you think Luke's right? She asked quietly. About the wind, I hesitated. I don't know. Maybe. You don't believe that, she said, glancing at me. It wasn't a question. No, I admitted, but I don't know what to believe. Jess nodded, her gaze drifting to the lake. Feels like it's watching us. I didn't have a response to that. I'd been thinking the same thing, but I didn't want to say it out loud. About half a mile from the cabin, Maddie stopped abruptly. She knelt down, brushing snow away from the ground. What is it? I asked, stepping closer. She didn't answer right away, her hands moving quickly as she uncovered something buried in the snow. Finally, she straightened up, holding a rusted tin box. It was small, maybe the size of a shoebox, and the lid was sealed shut with what looked like years of ice and grime. Jess frowned. What's that doing out here? Maddie shook her head. I don't know, but it doesn't belong here. She tried to open it, but the lid wouldn't budge. Let's take it back to the cabin, she said. We can figure it out there. I didn't argue, but I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was inside that box, we weren't meant to find it. Back at the cabin, we used a kitchen knife to pry the lid open. The smell hit us first, a musty, metallic scent that made me gag. Inside were old photographs, faded and warped from time. They showed a group of people standing by the lake, their expressions unreadable. Their clothes looked old, maybe from the 1950s or earlier. Who are they? Jess asked, picking up one of the photos. Probably the original owners of the cabin, Luke said, leaning over her shoulder. But Maddie shook her head. No, look at the lake. We all leaned in, and that's when I saw it. In every photo, the lake's surface wasn't smooth like it was now. It was rippling, as if something beneath the water was moving, and in one of the photos, there was a shadow, a long, dark shape just beneath the surface. "What the hell is that?" Ryan muttered. No one answered. That night the whispers returned, louder than ever. They seemed to come from all around us, circling the cabin like a pack of wolves. Maddie lit a fire in the fireplace, even though the cabin wasn't cold, and Jess turned on every light we could find. But the light didn't help. If anything, it made the shadows seem darker, more alive. I sat by the window, staring out at the lake. It was pitch black, the water blending into the sky. But as I watched, I thought I saw something, a faint glow, like fireflies, hovering just above the surface. I blinked, and it was gone. "You see it too, don't you?" Maddie said, sitting down beside me. I nodded. "What is it?" She didn't answer right away. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I think it's waiting." "Waiting for what?" She looked at me, her eyes wide and filled with fear. "For us." The whispers didn't stop until just before dawn. By then, we were all on edge, jumping at every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind against the windows. No one mentioned leaving, but I could see it in their eyes. They were thinking about it. I was thinking about it. But something told me it wouldn't be that easy. Morning broke through the cabin's thin curtains, but it didn't feel like morning. The sunlight struggled to pierce the overcast sky, casting everything in a dull gray. Inside, we looked like the remnants of a battlefield, exhausted, jumpy, and unsure of what we were fighting. Jess was the first to speak, breaking the silence with a voice barely above a whisper. "We can't stay another night here." Luke shook his head, his expression stoic. "We don't leave until tomorrow." That was the plan. The plan changed when the lake decided it wanted to talk to us. Ryan shot back, his words dripping with sarcasm that couldn't hide his unease. Maddie sat in the corner, clutching the tin box. She hadn't let it out of her sight since last night, her fingers tracing its edges absently, as if it might reveal more secrets. "It's not just the lake," she said, her voice steady but quiet. "It's this place, the cabin, the woods, all of it. It's connected." Luke sighed heavily and rubbed his temples. "We're not going to lose our minds over some creepy whispers and old photos. We stick to the plan. One more day, we'll be fine." Jess slammed her coffee mug down on the table, the sound jolting all of us. "Fine? We're not fine. Luke, none of this is fine." "You're pretending like..." Her voice cracked, and she stopped, visibly trying to rein in her emotions. I leaned forward, trying to calm the situation. "Look, maybe Luke's right about sticking to the plan, but we need to figure out what's going on here. Ignoring it isn't helping." Ryan chuckled bitterly. "Yeah, great idea. Let's just figure out why the lake's whispering and why we're all too scared to sleep. That'll solve everything." "Eat enough," Maddie interrupted, her voice commanding. For once, she stood and held up the tin box. "This is a clue, whether you want to admit it or not. Someone left this here for a reason, and we need to understand what it means." By mid-morning, we decided to split up again, though none of us felt great about it. Maddie insisted on staying at the cabin to study the photographs and the journal, while Luke and Ryan went to retrieve the second kayak they'd left by the far shore the previous day. Jess and I opted to follow, leading away from the cabin, my parents long asleep, hoping to find anything that might explain what was happening. The trail was narrow, flanked by trees whose branches intertwined overhead, forming a natural canopy. The air grew colder as we walked, our breath forming small clouds that hung in the still air. "Do you believe her?" Jess asked suddenly. I glanced at her. Who? Maddie. She nodded. All of it. The whispers, the shadows, the lake waiting. I hesitated. I don't know what to believe, but something's wrong here. It's not just in our heads. You feel it too, right? Jess stopped walking and turned to me, her eyes filled with fear. I don't just feel it. I see it. What do you mean? My voice dropped instinctively, as if speaking too loudly would summon whatever she'd seen. She hesitated, her gaze darting to the trees. Last night, when we were sitting by the fire, I saw something in the lake. It wasn't just a ripple or a shadow. It was watching us. I stared at her, unsure of how to respond. She must have taken my silence as skepticism, because she looked away, shaking her head. Forget it, she muttered. She muttered, starting to walk again. Jess, I called after her. I don't think you're crazy. I struggled to find the right words. I don't know how to process it. Neither of us said anything more as we continued down the trail. We came across an old, dilapidated structure about a mile from the cabin. It looked like it had once been a storage shed, though time and the elements had reduced it to little more than a skeleton of rotting wood and rusted nails. Jess and I exchanged a glance before cautiously stepping inside. The air inside was stale, carrying a faint metallic tang. Rusted tools hung on the walls, their edges dulled by years of neglect. But what caught my attention was the floor. Scrolled across the wooden planks were symbols, dozens of them, carved deeply into the wood as if someone had spent hours, maybe days, etching them. What the hell is this? Jess whispered, kneeling to get a closer look. The symbols were strange, almost tribal, but nothing I recognized. They spiraled and overlapped, creating patterns that seemed to twist and shift if you stared too long. It looks deliberate, I said, my voice uneasy. Like someone was trying to, I don't know, mark this place. But Jess ran her fingers over one of the carvings, and her breath hitched. It's warm. I knelt beside her, touching the same symbol. She was right. It was warm to the touch, almost unnaturally so, given the freezing air around us. We should leave, I said quickly, standing up. Jess didn't argue. When we got back to the cabin, Luke and Ryan were already there. Ryan looked pale, and Luke's usual bravado was gone, replaced by a grim expression. What happened? I asked, sensing the tension. Luke hesitated, glancing at Ryan. The kayak's gone. What do you mean gone? I mean it's not where we left it, Ryan said, his voice shaking. We checked the whole area. It's like it just disappeared. Maybe the wind carried it off. Luke offered, though he didn't sound convinced. There was no wind, Ryan snapped. And even if there was, it wouldn't drag a kayak that far. Something took it. Jess and I exchanged a worried look. We found something too, I said, explaining the symbols we'd seen in the shed. Maddie listened intently, her grip tightening on the tin box. It's all connected, she said when I finished. The photos, the journal, the symbols, warnings. Someone, maybe the people in those pictures, knew what was happening here. And they tried to stop it. Stop what? Ryan asked, his voice rising. What are we even talking about? Shadows, whispers. This whole thing is insane. It doesn't matter if it's insane, Maddie said sharply. It's real. And if we don't figure it out, we're not leaving this place. That night, the tension in the cabin was suffocating. We stayed in the living room, too afraid to separate. Maddie spread out the photographs and the journal on the coffee table, while the rest of us huddled close, our eyes darting to the windows every few seconds. As the hours passed, the whispers returned. This time, they were louder, more distinct. They didn't just circle the cabin, they filled it. seeping into the walls and floorboards. Words began to form, though they were garbled and fragmented, like a voice trying to speak underwater. Leave, one voice seemed to say. Stay, another countered. The contradictions were maddening. Jess covered her ears, tears streaming down her face. Luke paced the room, muttering curses under his breath. Ryan sat frozen, staring at the floor, and then the lights flickered. When they came back on, Maddie was standing by the window, her face pale. It's in the lake, she said, her voice barely audible. What's in the lake? I demanded, moving toward her. She turned to face me, her eyes wide with terror. It's not waiting anymore. Outside, the lake was no longer still. The water rippled and churned, despite the absence of wind. And in the center, a shape began to emerge, tall, dark, and utterly inhuman. It wasn't waiting. It was coming. The air inside the cabin felt stifling, thick with the weight of our collective fear. We huddled in the living room, Maddie clutching the tin box like it was a lifeline, while Jess stared out the window, her breath fogging the glass. Ryan paced the room like a caged animal, muttering under his breath, while Luke tried and failed to maintain an air of control. Outside, the lake churned unnaturally. The ripples weren't just from the wind, they pulsed outward in rhythmic waves, like something beneath the surface was moving. The shape we'd glimpsed earlier had vanished, but its presence lingered, a palpable force pressing against us. I tried to focus, to think logically, but my mind kept circling back to one question. What is this thing? We can't stay here, Jess said, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. We need to leave. No, how? Luke shot back. The kayaks are gone. The trail's barely passable with all this snow. You want to freeze to death out there? It's better than staying here, she snapped. That thing, whatever it is, it's coming for us. We don't even know what it wants, Maddie murmured, her eyes fixed on the tin box. It doesn't matter what it wants, Ryan said, his voice sharp. It's not playing games. Look at the lake. Look at what's happening. It's not waiting for us to figure this out. Silence fell over the room. None of us had an answer, but deep down, we all knew the truth. We were trapped. As the hours dragged on, we tried to distract ourselves, but the oppressive tension made it impossible. Luke started flipping through the journal, his skepticism eroding with every frantic entry he read. He knew. He muttered, his finger tracing the erratic handwriting. Whoever wrote this, they knew exactly what was here. What does it say? I asked. He flipped to a page near the back, holding it up so we could see. The words were scrawled in bold, uneven strokes, as if the writer had been shaking. It's not the lake, it's what's beneath it. Don't disturb the water, but Jess's face paled. Beneath it. What does that mean? Exactly what it sounds like, Luke replied. There's something under the lake, and if these entries are right, it doesn't want us here. Maddie set the tin box on the table, her hands trembling. The photos, she whispered. They all showed something in the water, a shadow, a shape. Ryan, who had been pacing, stopped abruptly. So what? Are we just supposed to wait here for it to come get us? No, I said firmly. We need to figure out what this thing is and how to stop it. Stop it. Ryan laughed bitterly. Do you hear yourself? This isn't some ghost story where we find the magic words and everything's fine. This is real, and it's going to kill us. Then what do you suggest? Maddie asked, her voice sharp. Running, hiding. You saw what happened to the kayak. Do you really think it'll let us leave? Ryan opened his mouth to argue, but no words came out. Instead, he sank into a chair, his head in his hands. By nightfall, the whispers returned, They started faint, like they had the first night, but quickly grew louder, more insistent. This time, they weren't just words. There were sounds of scraping, splashing, like claws against wood, and something heavy moving through water. Luke grabbed the journal and started flipping through it frantically. There has to be something here, some kind of clue. Quit. Maddie interrupted, her eyes wide. Do you hear that? We all froze, straining to listen. The whispers seemed to converge, their voices overlapping, until they became one guttural, incomprehensible sound. Then, suddenly, it stopped. A loud thud echoed from the direction of the lake. We stared at each other, our breaths shallow, waiting for the next sound. Another thud followed, this one closer. And then the scraping began again, rhythmic and deliberate, like something was dragging itself closer. It's here. Jess whispered, tears streaming down her face. It's here. We have to move, I said, grabbing the flashlight from the table. We can't just sit here. And go where? Luke demanded. Out out there, into the forest. It'll pick us off one by one. Before I could respond, the window behind Jess shattered, spraying glass across the room. She screamed, stumbling backward as something dark and wet lashed through the broken frame. It wasn't a hand, more like a tendril, long and sinewy, glistening with water and leaving streaks of black slime on the walls. Move, I shouted, grabbing Jess and pulling her away. The tendril writhed, sweeping across the room as if searching for something. Luke grabbed a fire poker and swung it, striking the thing with a sickening squelch. It recoiled, retreating back through the window, but we knew it wasn't gone. We can't stay here, Maddie said, her voice trembled. We need to get to the mine. The mine. Ryan looked at her like she'd lost her mind. Are you serious? You think hiding underground is going to save us? It's the only place we haven't searched, she said. The journal mentioned the mine. Maybe there's something there that can help. Or maybe it's where that thing came from, Ryan shot back. Do you have a better idea? Maddie snapped. The scraping outside grew louder, accompanied by deep, guttural noises that sent chills down my spine. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't leaving. Fine, Luke said. The mine it is, but we move fast. No stopping, no splitting up. We grabbed what supplies we could, a flashlight, the journal, the tin box, and bolted out the back door. The forest was eerily silent, the whispers having ceased entirely. The snow crunched beneath our boots as we made our way toward the mine, guided only by the dim beam of the flashlight. The entrance to the mine was a gaping black hole in the side of a hill, framed by rotting wooden beams that groaned under their own weight. The air was colder here, almost suffocatingly so, and the darkness seemed to pulse as if alive. We shouldn't be here, Ryan muttered, his voice barely audible. Keep moving, Luke said, pushing him forward. Inside the mine was narrow and damp, the walls slick with moisture. The beam of the flashlight illuminated strange carvings on the walls, symbols similar to the ones we'd seen in the shed, spiraling and interlocking in ways that made my head ache to look at. This isn't right, Jess whispered. These symbols, they're not just carvings. They're warnings. Warnings for what? Luke asked, though his voice betrayed his fear. Maddie stopped abruptly, holding up the flashlight to illuminate something ahead. In the center of the tunnel was a circular opening, like a well, its edges lined with jagged stones. The air around it seemed to hum, a low, vibrating frequency that made my teeth ache. What is this? Ryan asked, his voice shaking. It's a shaft, Maddie said, her voice barely above a whisper. It goes straight down to something. To something, Luke repeated. What does that mean? Before Maddie could answer, the humming grew louder, reverberating through the tunnel. The flashlight flickered, and for a brief moment, the shadows seemed to move, converging on the well. "We need to leave," Jess said, backing away. No, but it was too late. The shadows coalesced, rising from the well like smoke. They weren't just dark, they were alive, their shapes shifting and twisting, forming something vaguely humanoid. Eyes, if they could even be called that, glowed faintly within the darkness, watching us. And then it spoke, its voice a guttural rasp that echoed through the tunnel. "You shouldn't have come." The flashlight went out. The darkness swallowed us whole. In the absence of light, the mind's oppressive cold seemed to deepen, wrapping around me like icy fingers. Jess's panicked breathing was the only sound, ragged and sharp in the suffocating silence. "Turn it back on," Ryan hissed, his voice trembling. "I'm trying." Luke's voice came from somewhere to my left, his frustration tinged with fear. The faint click of the flashlight switch was the only response. And then, as if taunting us, the guttural voice returned. "You were warned." The sound was unlike anything I'd ever heard. Deep, resonant, and filled with something ancient. It wasn't just a voice, it was a feeling, a vibration that settled in my chest and threatened to suffocate me. "We have to move," Maddie whispered, her tone urgent but steady. "Follow the wall. Don't lose your bearings." I reached out blindly, my hand finding the damp, cold stone. Slowly, I began to shuffle forward, keeping the wall to my right. The others followed, their footsteps uneven and hesitant. "Don't look back," Maddie added. Her words sent a chill down my spine. What did she think we'd see? The shadows didn't just stay in the well, they moved, creeping along the walls like living smoke. Occasionally, I'd catch a flicker of movement in my peripheral vision, a tendril of darkness reaching toward me, only to retreat when I turned my head. "We're getting nowhere," Ryan muttered, his voice tight with panic. "We're just walking blind into..." Crunch, crunch. Ryan stopped mid-sentence, his words replaced by a sharp intake of breath. "What was that?" Jess whispered. "I don't know," Ryan said, his voice barely audible. "I think I stepped on something." Luke fumbled with the flashlight again, and this time it sputtered to life, casting a weak, flickering beam. Ryan knelt, brushing away the dirt and revealing a collection of bones. Not animal bones. Human. "Oh my God," Jess whispered, backing away. The flashlight revealed more bones, scattered across the ground, some crushed, others arranged in strange, deliberate patterns. Symbols, spirals, and crude figures marked the floor, drawn with what looked like dried blood. "He didn't leave," Maddie said, her voice hollow. "The people in the journal, this is what happened to them." Before anyone could respond, the humming returned, louder and more intense. The air vibrated, the frequency so low it felt like my skull was going to split. "We can't stay here," I said, grabbing Maddie's arm. "We have to get out." "And go where?" Luke snapped. "You want to go back out there, to the lake." "No one's saying that," I said. "But staying here is worse." The shadows moved again, and this time they weren't just watching. A tendril of darkness shot out from the wall, wrapping around Luke's arm. He shouted in pain as the tendril pulled, dragging him toward the well. "Help me," he screamed, his voice echoing through the mine. We all lunged at once, grabbing hold of him and pulling with everything we had. The tendril was cold, its surface slick and alive, pulsing like a heartbeat. It writhed, resisting us, and for a moment I thought we'd lose him. Then, with a sound like tearing fabric, the tendril snapped, retreating back into the shadows. Luke collapsed to the ground, clutching his arm, a dark mark like a burn marred his skin. It's getting stronger, Maddie said, her voice shaking. We woke it up off. Then we need to put it back to sleep, I said, my voice firmer than I felt. Whatever it is, it's tied to this place. The lake, the mine, the symbols, there has to be a way to stop it. Or it stops us, Ryan muttered. We pressed on the flashlight, our only lifeline. The deeper we went, the more the mine seemed to change. The walls grew smoother, the symbols more intricate, as if the mine itself were alive, reshaping to guide us or trap us. Finally, we came to a large cavern, its ceiling disappearing into darkness. In the center was a massive stone altar, its surface etched with the same spiraling patterns we'd seen before. Surrounding it were more bones, arranged in concentric circles. This is it, Maddie said, her voice barely a whisper. This is where it started, and where it ends. You shouldn't have come, the guttural voice replied, sending a ripple of terror through the group. The shadows in the room began to converge, pooling around the altar like ink spreading through water. From the center, the dark shape began to rise again, its form shifting and twisting. It was humanoid, but only barely, its limbs too long, its movements too fluid. Eyes, if they could be called that, glowed faintly within the blackness. Maddie stepped forward, holding the tin box. This is why we found it, she said, her voice trembling but determined. It's a key. It has to be a key. To what? I asked, my heart pounding. To lock it away, she replied. The people in the photos, they tried to stop it. That's why they left the journal, the symbols they didn't finish. But maybe we can. The shadow creature stepped closer, its presence oppressive. It didn't attack, but it didn't need to. Just being near it felt like drowning, like my very existence was being pulled into its void. What do we do? Luke asked, his voice cracking. Maddie opened the tin box, revealing the faded photographs inside. She pulled one out, holding it up to the light. The figures in the photo stared back at us, their faces solemn, their hands raised as if in prayer. Replicate the symbols, she said, pointing to the altar. Quickly, we scrambled to copy the patterns from the photos onto the altar, using pieces of chalk we'd found earlier in the mine. The symbols glowed faintly as we worked, the air around us growing heavier with each stroke. The shadow creature roared, its form expanding, tendrils lashing out in every direction. One struck Ryan, sending him sprawling across the cavern. Jess screamed, but she didn't stop drawing. Hurry, Maddie shouted. As we completed the final symbol, the cavern shook violently. The light from the symbols intensified, forming a barrier of blinding energy around the altar. The shadow creature writhed and screamed, its form unraveling like smoke in the wind. And then it was gone. We stumbled out of the mine hours later, exhausted but alive. The lake was still, the oppressive presence lifted. For the first time in days, the air felt light, almost peaceful. We kept moving, though the tension between us was palpable. But as we walked, the whispers grew louder. No longer faint suggestions, but full voices, overlapping and echoing in the air around us. They spoke in a language I couldn't understand, but the intent was clear. Turn back. Ryan was the first to crack. He stopped abruptly, shaking his head. I can't do this, he said, his voice trembling. I can't. I'm not going back there. No one's going back, I said firmly, grabbing his arm. We're almost out. But Ryan shook his head violently, pulling away. You don't get it. It's not going to let us leave. We're already dead. Don't say that. Jess snapped, tears streaming down her face. We're not dead. We're not. Ryan laughed bitterly, a sound that sent chills down my spine. You think we made it out of that mine alive? You think it just let us go? Ryan, stop, I said, stepping toward him. You're not thinking straight? No, he said, backing away. You're the ones who aren't thinking. This place of it's already taken us. We just haven't realized it yet. Before I could stop him, Ryan turned and bolted into the woods, his figure disappearing quickly into the shadows. The sound of his footsteps was swallowed by the oppressive silence. Ryan, Jess screamed, starting after him. But I grabbed her arm. No, I said firmly. We can't follow him. That's what it wants. She struggled against me, but Maddie stepped forward, placing a hand on her shoulder. He's gone, Maddie said softly. We can't save him. The rest of the walk was a blur. The whispers grew louder, the air heavier, and the forest darker. By the time we reached the trailhead, I could barely stand. The others looked just as drained, their faces pale and their eyes hollow. But the road was there. The snow-covered asphalt stretched out before us like a lifeline, leading back to civilization. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. The whispers didn't stop. Maddie was the first to speak, her voice barely audible. It's not over. Gawk, what do you mean? Luke demanded, his voice fraying at the edges. We're out. We're safe? She shook her head, holding up the journal. The last entry, it said it doesn't want us to leave. We didn't leave it behind. It's still with us. No, Jess whispered, backing away. No, we're safe. We made it out. But even as she said the words, the truth was clear. The oppressive feeling hadn't lifted. The weight in my chest, the whispers in my ears, they weren't fading. They were getting stronger. We have to go back, Maddie said, her voice breaking. We have to finish it. No, Luke said firmly. Absolutely not. I'm not going back there. Whatever this is, we'll figure it out later. But I'm not stepping foot in that place again. You don't understand, Maddie said, tears streaming down her face. If we don't stop it, it'll spread. It'll follow us. It'll follow everyone. For a moment, no one spoke. The weight of her words hung in the air, suffocating and undeniable. And then the whispers stopped. The silence that followed was worse. It wasn't natural. It was a vacuum, a void that pressed down on us like a tidal wave. And then I saw it, in the distance. Just beyond the edge of the road, the shadows began to move. They coalesced, forming a shape, a tall, inhuman figure with glowing eyes that stared directly at us. It wasn't waiting anymore. I don't know what happened after that. The next thing I remember, I was standing on the side of the road, alone. The others were gone. The journal, the tin box, everything was gone. The only thing left was the sound of the wind and the faint echo of a voice in my mind. You were never supposed to leave. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at the forest. Eventually a car passed, and I flagged it down. The driver asked if I was okay, but I couldn't answer. I just nodded, got in, and told him to drive. I've tried to forget what happened, but I can't. The whispers haven't stopped. They're quieter now, but they're always there, in the back of my mind. And at night, when I close my eyes, I see the lake. I see the shadows. And I know it's still waiting for me, for all of us.